What would you do if the person you loved most walked into the worst night of your life, believed a cruel lie before hearing your truth, and destroyed the only chance you had left to save both your future and hers? That evening did not begin with betrayal. It began with exhaustion so deep it had almost become a habit. In a dim room, lit only by the weak glow of a desk lamp, CEO Jack sat alone with a whiskey glass in one trembling hand, and the wreckage of his failed plans spread before him like a judgment. The company was collapsing under the weight of stalled deals, and the plot of land tied up in urban planning had become a trap instead of a rescue. Debt pressed on his chest like stone. In the next room, Tu Tien slept without knowing how close he stood to ruin, and Jack, who had once believed hard work could solve anything, no longer knew whether he had enough strength left to stand upright under the burden. Then, like a thin flame in the middle of a storm, one final business opportunity appeared. A dinner meeting with a female partner might still lead to a contract, and that contract might still pull him away from bankruptcy. But before hope could take root, a vicious rumor reached Tu Tien first. By the time she arrived at the restaurant, jealousy had already turned love into violence. A slap shattered the evening. A contract was canceled. Months of sacrifice collapsed in seconds. Yet what made the night unforgettable was not only the damage. It was that after humiliation, after fury, after loss, Jack still chose to hold the woman who had wronged him and forgive her before he had even forgiven himself. A single lamp threw weak yellow light across the desk, leaving the rest of the room drowned in shadow. The contract papers before Jack were no longer neat. Some had been crumpled, flattened again, and pushed aside with the helpless frustration of a man who had spent too many nights trying to calculate a future that refused to obey him. His whiskey sat half-finished, untouched long enough to lose whatever warmth it once held. Outside the window, the night pressed against the glass, distant and indifferent. Jack lowered his head and breathed slowly, but even that felt difficult. Bankruptcy had not yet officially arrived, yet it already lived inside the room with him. The land issue tied to the planning project had swallowed every comforting illusion of security. On paper, there were assets. In reality, there was only frozen value, unpaid pressure, and the constant humiliation of knowing that each passing week made his situation more fragile. The company still had his name. It no longer felt like it still obeyed his will. In the next room, Tu Tien slept quietly. Her breathing, faint through the wall, should have soothed him. Instead, it made his chest ache. She had become the most fragile and most precious thing inside a life that was steadily breaking apart. He wanted to protect her. He wanted to hold her. He wanted to build a future where loving her did not feel like inviting her into a burning house. Yet, the deeper he fell into financial ruin, the more unworthy of tenderness he felt. He stared at the shredded papers again. How had it come to this? He had worked, negotiated, calculated, pushed, endured, and still, the road ahead looked like emptiness. He felt remorse not only for the risks he had taken, but for the fact that Tu Tien had entered his life at a time when he had so little stability left to offer. He feared the future the way some men fear death. Not because it was unknown, but because its shape was beginning to become visible. And still, somewhere beneath the despair, one stubborn instinct remained. He could not stop trying. The restaurant was elegant without trying too hard. Polished surfaces reflected the amber glow of chandeliers. Deep red wine caught the light inside tall glasses. Soft music drifted somewhere behind the low murmur of conversation. Across from him sat the female partner whose approval might still give him the project he needed. Jack had dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but out of necessity. He was there not as a man enjoying dinner, but as someone negotiating against disaster with his last intact piece of dignity. He spoke carefully, and she listened. There were questions about terms, timing, figures, risk, and projected return. Jack answered everything with controlled calm, though his heart beat harder with each minute that the conversation continued without collapsing. For the first time in months, he sensed that a door might still open. It was not success yet, only possibility. But possibility was enough to make his breathing feel less heavy. Then, the mood softened. The partner smiled, remarked that they should continue the discussion over dinner, and signaled for the wine to be refreshed. There was nothing inappropriate in the gesture, nothing intimate beyond politeness. Yet to Jack, it felt like a strange mercy. He nodded and let himself imagine, for one dangerous instant, that he might still save everything, that he might repay what needed repaying, that he might return home not empty-handed but with the first piece of real hope he had touched in a very long time. When he stepped aside for a moment and took out his phone, he sent Tu Tien a short message. He had no idea that somewhere else, another message was already moving faster than truth. Tu Tien was alone when the rumor reached her. The apartment was dark, except for the cold light of her phone. She had been waiting, though she would never have admitted it in those words. Waiting for his step at the door. Waiting for his voice. Waiting for some sign that the distance growing between his burdens and her heart had not become too wide. Then the screen lit up with something else entirely. A message. A whisper sharpened into a knife. CEO Jack had abandoned her for a rich woman. For one moment, Tu Tien did not move. Then her whole body changed. Her grip tightened until the phone felt as if it might crack in her hand. Her breath became shallow. The sentence on the screen entered all the places where fear had already been sleeping inside her. She had loved him with all the fierce devotion of someone who had once believed she could be left behind by fate itself. So when jealousy struck, it found no resistance. It erupted instantly, fed not by evidence but by insecurity, love, and terror. Tears spilled down her face before reason had time to gather itself. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard across the floor. The room became unbearable, too still, too tight, too full of everything she did not want to imagine. She no longer cared how late it was or how foolish she might look. She only knew she had to go there, had to see the truth with her own eyes, had to tear the lie open before it buried her. By the time she reached the restaurant, jealousy had become a fire she no longer knew how to extinguish. The elegant calm inside the room only made her fury more violent. Warm lights, wine glasses, low conversation, and there he was, sitting across from another woman. The entire scene arranged itself in her mind, not as business, but as betrayal. She did not pause long enough to ask. She did not let his message, his exhaustion, his reality, or her love slow her down. She crossed the room and struck first. The slap landed with a sound sharp enough to silence the nearest tables. A wine glass toppled and shattered. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back violently. The female partner clutched her cheek in stunned humiliation. Jack turned too late, already rising, already pale with disbelief as the scene exploded around him. "Stop!" he shouted, but the word arrived after the damage. Tu Tien stood there breathing hard, her eyes red, her whole body trembling with the adrenaline of a mistake not yet fully visible to her. Jack stepped between them. And for one suspended second all the hope he had carried through the evening broke inside him like glass. He understood immediately what had happened. The rumor, the jealousy, the poison of a lie entering before the truth had a chance to speak. He looked at the partner, then at Tu Tien, and felt the terrible sensation of months of effort slipping out of his hands in plain sight. Her face had become expressionless in the way only deeply offended people become expressionless. Her voice shook not from weakness but from anger, held under control as she informed Jack that the contract was canceled immediately. Nothing further would be discussed. Nothing would continue. That sentence was the real blow. Jack stood frozen. Rage surged through him, but it was tangled with heartbreak so deeply he could barely separate the two. He had fought for this meeting, carried it like a final match in darkness, and now it was gone because the woman he loved had believed a rumor before she believed him. Tu Tien's face changed then. The fury in her expression began to crack. She looked at the partner's cheek, the broken glass, the cold finality in Jack's eyes, and realization entered her slowly. Then all at once, horror followed it. Not because anyone struck her back, because she finally understood what she had destroyed. Outside, rain had begun to fall. It was thin, almost delicate, silver under the streetlights. Jack followed her out, not because he had stopped being angry, but because anger had already given way to something heavier. She stood beneath a yellow lamp, shaking with the first terrible waves of regret. He stopped in front of her and looked at her for one long second. Then he pulled her into his arms. She stiffened, then broke. Her tears soaked into his shirt, while the rain gathered in her hair and on his shoulders. He could still feel the loss of the contract like a wound inside his chest. The pressure of bankruptcy had returned with twice the force now that hope had been so close. Yet standing there in the rain, he could not make himself push her away. He told her the truth. It had been only a business dinner. The woman was a partner, not a lover. The project had been the last real chance to pull himself out of the wreckage. Every word landed harder because it was spoken without cruelty. His disappointment did not need shouting. It already lived fully in the space between them. Tu Tien trembled harder. Regret rose through her like a flood. She had not protected love. She had humiliated it. She had not uncovered betrayal. She had become the betrayal. Every insecurity that had driven her there now turned against her, exposing the ugliness of what she had done. Jack's hand moved slowly over her hair. The rain softened around them. The night narrowed to breathing. Streetlight, wet pavement, and the ache of two hearts standing inside the ruins of misunderstanding. At last, overwhelmed by shame, Tu Tien sank to her knees on the wet ground and apologized. Not gracefully, not in polished words, in sobs. Jack's face tightened as he bent immediately, pulled her to her feet, and held her again. He whispered forgiveness before the anger in him had even fully cooled, because love in him had always been stronger than punishment. They began walking home hand in hand through the rain. Neither of them had been made innocent by the night. The contract was still lost. The debts still waited. The future remained uncertain and frightening, but something fragile had returned between them: truth. Tu Tien rested her head against his shoulder. Jack, exhausted almost beyond feeling, let that small closeness remain. Perhaps that was the cruel and beautiful truth of the night. Love does not survive because people never misunderstand one another. It survives only when truth is finally allowed to speak louder than pride, fear, jealousy, and shame. Under the dim yellow lights and the rain that would not stop falling, Jack and Tu Tien found each other again, not in triumph, but in confession, remorse, and the painful choice to keep walking forward together, even after one terrible mistake had changed everything.